Busy morning. Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to the House Committee on Government Operations and Military Affairs. It's Thursday, April 13th, and we're here to take additional testimony on S32 and to hear a little introductory of a related House Bill H424. But I wanted to have the reporter of S32 from the Senate, Senator Vyhovsky, here. So welcome.
Thank you. For the record, Senator Tanya Vyhovsky. And I did report S32 on the floor. This bill started out as a bill that would have applied to the presidential election in 2024. And we heard pretty loudly and clearly from our town clerks and our Secretary of State that they just could not be ready on that tight of a timeline. So we worked with them to make the bill that is actually in front of you one that they all agreed on, so that all of the major stakeholders are in agreement with the bill in front of you. And it does three major things. The first thing that it does is it allows municipalities to opt in to ranked choice voting for local elections. And there's two ways that they can do this. They can do this by a vote of all the people or by a vote of the governing body. Importantly, to eliminate any ping pong effect of the people saying one thing and the governing body saying another, we have some limitations on what the governing body can do. So they can vote to enact ranked choice voting, and the people could vote to get rid of it if they decide they don't want it. But if the people vote to enact ranked choice voting, the governing body can't repeal it. It can only be repealed by the people. The other thing that this bill does is it creates a summer study committee with all of the relevant stakeholders to answer all of the logistical questions that were of concern to them, and to look at what it would take to implement ranked choice voting in our statewide and federal elections beginning in 2026. And it does codify that the 2028 presidential primary will be by ranked choice voting. That's really what the bill does. And I'm happy to take any questions or.
A lot of my questions were just about the conversation about how the municipal opt-in would work. So some of the conversations we've had in here have been about sort of what the clerk's sort of role will be. So the select board or the people can opt to have their local municipal elections go to ranked choice. And did you talk at all in your committee about the timeline of when would the first real election that they'd be able to do that happen if a town decided to do it?
I mean, it would obviously depend on when they decided to do it, but in the bill, the first allowable time would be the 2024 municipal elections.
Okay.
And there was money in the bill for training of town clerks, but as is custom in the Senate, Appropriations pulled that out and put it on the wall for the larger budgetary conversation. There's also organizations all across the country that will provide training to municipalities. Burlington enacted ranked choice voting for their most recent municipal elections and actually ended up having to do it much sooner than expected because there was a resignation in a special election. And the city clerk was provided support from ranked choice voting experts to really make that run smoothly. And she actually testified in our committee that it went much more smoothly than she expected it to. And they didn't really have time to do much voter education. And yet there were no spoiled ballots due to ranked choice voting errors. And the voters really largely said that they understood it and appreciated it.
So if a community voted to adopt ranked choice voting for their municipal elections at their 2024 town meeting, it would really be whatever the following election was.
Exactly.
That they would have.
Exactly. So it really does depend. I know a couple of communities have not yet had their 2023 municipal meeting. If the governing body decided to do it, they could do it outside of that. And that's actually why we allowed for both pathways. So if a community really wanted to do it for 2024, they had a couple of avenues to get there, given that by the time we moved this bill, we were past the majority of communities' town meetings.
Oh, go ahead, Representative.
Thank you, Senator Vyhovsky. Just a question and a concern that I've always had is, was there any discussion about, a voter that maybe doesn't understand the ranked choice voting, and let's say there's 4 candidates and they're only going to vote for one. Is their vote disenfranchised to some extent because they're only voting for one? I mean, how does that, was there concern about that or discussion?
I mean, you can vote, you can rank as many candidates as you want to, or only vote for one under the system. There's no requirement that you rank candidates. If someone voted for only one person, it would be just like it is now. If that person isn't, drops out of the race or isn't climbing to the top, then their vote would, just like it does now, not count to that candidate, because that candidate ultimately isn't going to win, but it isn't going to make it so their vote isn't cast. But it's really up to the voter. They may look at a list of four and be like, I really only like one of these people, and that's fine. They're still going to get to vote for just one person. Their ballot is going to count. But if that person, one of the things we heard a lot about in testimony was particularly the volatility of like a presidential primary where there's so many candidates. And with early voting, people would vote and then the candidate would drop out before the election, but after they'd voted, and then their vote, like they cast it for that candidate and it's going to count towards that candidate, but it's not really going to matter in the grand scheme of things because that candidate's no longer running. And with a method of ranked choice, if they had picked a second or a third candidate, their vote would have been allocated to that candidate based on the ranked choice voting method. So I hope that answers your question.
No, I think so.
Okay.
Again, I worry about, a number of folks doing that and then, having an individual and I'm familiar with the Burlington issue of, a candidate that what didn't come in the first two counts at all, winning the election. And so again, I have a little concern with that.
Understandable. It's definitely a shift from what we do now. And right now, I mean, in the 2024 presidential Democratic primary, over 6,000 votes weren't counted because candidates had dropped out ahead of the election. So many of those votes, had they been ranked, would have been allocated to another candidate. So we already have a system that makes it so if someone votes for a candidate that drops out, their vote isn't counted towards a candidate that's still in the race.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So some of the conversation we're about to have is about methodology, and I was wondering how the Senate GovOps committee kind of came to a decision around, especially for the presidential primary in 2028, saying this is going to be method IRB.
Yeah, absolutely. So we did hear from a bunch of people and national experts around the different methodologies, and the Hare method is the method that is widely used across the world, has been used in over 500 races. And it really felt like we didn't want to be a guinea pig trying a theoretical approach when there were national experts and many other municipalities, both across the country and the world, that already use this method. It just felt tried and true and proven. There's no perfect method. And so that is really where we came to that decision, just based on the widespread use and sort of proven nature of this particular method.
Other questions from the committee? Senator Vihoski, is there anything like higher level about sort of why? I know, for instance, like in my local paper, there was this sort of like, what problem are we trying to solve op-ed about ranked choice voting in this week. So I'm wondering if you might want to like answer that kind of higher level, like why should we be doing this in the first place question before we kind of get into some of the weeds with this.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a bunch of reasons that ranked choice really, in my view, is more democratic. One, we've already spoken to, all of the votes that don't get counted because candidates have dropped out, as well as allowing, when you allow someone to rank candidates, you actually can make the election system more equitable for candidates, because, candidates who might be viewed as a spoiler candidate or candidates who might be viewed as sort of long shot candidates can still run and put their name out there, and people can vote for who they believe in without being worried that their vote is sort of going to be a spoiler or is going to make someone they really don't like win by ranking those candidates. So if that spoiler candidate's their first, or spoiler candidate is their first choice and they don't climb to the level of making it through the rounds, they still have a second choice that can go to the candidate that they say, I'd be okay with that person, as opposed to simply not counting and not being allocated towards anyone. There's also research, and we heard from people out there, that actually ranked choice voting allows for more diverse candidates to win. It seems to allow for women to have a better chance. It seems to allow for people of color to have a better chance to be really competitive in a race. And we also see that it decreases rancor in elections because you don't want to trash your opponent because you're looking for your opponent's second choice or third choice. And so it allows candidates to really run more on issues, even if they're sort of closely aligned, without creating some of that not volatility, but just the rancor that we sometimes see in elections. So there's a bunch of reasons why ranked choice voting just creates better elections.
Right, because the candidate's thinking, I at least want to be the second choice of a candidate who might share some of my position's supporters.
Yeah, exactly.
Representative Byron.
So surrounding these conversations, I commonly hear the word spoiler. So how do you, is that something that's, it's very common in the vernacular. So can you just walk me through the spoiler concept?
Yeah, absolutely. So if we have a race with 3 candidates and 2 of them are sort of closely aligned but have some distinct differences, and one of them is a candidate that's pretty different, and I'm a voter and I'm like, oh, I really like this candidate. I don't mind this candidate, but I hate that candidate. But the candidate I really like is sort of viewed as a long shot candidate. I may choose not to vote for the candidate that I really like because I'm really worried that the candidate I really don't like is going to win if I don't vote for the candidate that I kind of like. Whereas under ranked choice, I can give the candidate I really like my number 1 spot, the candidate I kind of like my number 2 spot, and not vote at all for the third candidate. And if my number 1 candidate is in fact a long shot and doesn't make it through, my number 2 vote would actually count towards that candidate that I'm okay with.
Okay, so the concern is more trying to maintain the position within a certain ideological vein by being able to have the scoring work more weightedly towards 2 people who are similar products politically.
I'm not entirely sure I understand your question.
So, I mean, I guess what I'm asking is like within that, it's, I think the part where I'm trying to unpack this right now is I think I see a little bit more what you're saying in all the other states that have just 2 major parties, but with 3 major parties here, isn't that kind of what the 3-party system is for?
Well, and I think one of the things that we have certainly seen sometimes with our 3-party system is we have exactly what we're talking about, that the candidates that are kind of similar sort of split the vote, and the candidate that actually isn't as similar ends up coming through. And if all of the people who had voted for the 2 candidates are kind of similar, had voted for the same person, then a really different outcome would happen. But this would allow for people, like I said, for those votes to be shifted if one of the 2 candidates that are sort of splitting the votes don't reach a majority.
So would another way to say this, I mean, or to think about this be that in the majority of our elections, somebody does win 50% plus 1. And so, but in those instances where there are multiple candidates and there isn't like a clear favorite, this allows people to sort of rank the person that they feel strongest about without thinking necessarily about the strategic positioning of the candidate that they see as being more popular, but maybe isn't their favorite.
Yes. Absolutely. And in an instance where a candidate wins 50% plus 1, ranked choice voting never comes into effect. They just win the election. In an instance where we have a candidate that maybe got 37% of the vote and a candidate that got 34% of the vote and a candidate that got 20% of the vote, the person who got 20% would be eliminated and their second choices would be allocated to the remaining 2. And as soon as a candidate hits that 50% plus 1 threshold, they have won the election.
Any other questions for Senator Vyhovsky? All right. Thanks for your work on this. Thanks for being with us this morning. I know it was busy, so.
Thank you.
Get out of here.
It's nice to be back in my original home.
All right. So, Tim, could you join us and take us on a walkthrough and remind us of the language? We've taken a little bit of introductory testimony on this. I don't think we've yet done any real formal pass through the bill with you, to my knowledge.
Sure.
with all of the bills we've worked on. And having done a little bit of testimony on this, I was forgetting a little bit whether I had just walked through the bill or whether we had done it all together. So thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me, Mr. Chair. Just to provide a little bit of a recap. Let's see, I think I was here on March 31st, and I had produced a bill overview for the committee, and we had gone through that and given an idea of the structure and some of the detail, but not going really deep into the nuances of the bill. In particular, we kind of skimmed over the methodology. Would you like, and I believe the overview is again posted on the page, and maybe a good resource to kind of go through that again and bounce into particular language, or how would the chair prefer?
Yeah, I think if we can just kind of remind the committee of what we saw in the overview, what the components of the bill are.
Sure.
That would help. We don't need to do a line by line.
Okay.
Right now at this point.
Okay. So keeping it pretty high level and just reading from the overview here. This bill proposes three main items. One, to enable towns, cities, and villages to opt into a ranked choice voting, RCV system, for the election of a candidate running for an office in a town, city, or village, for example, a select board member or a mayor. But also like to add, this is not applying to school boards at this point. This is sections 1 through 4. Ranked choice voting will not apply to public questions either. So really just for those officers in town. 2, this bill will also create a ranked choice voting study committee to examine issues of implementing ranked choice voting in Vermont across all elections for state and federal offices. And 3, this bill will require the use of ranked choice voting for U.S. presidential primary elections for each major political party. And that will be enacted, not for this coming presidential primary cycle, but the one after that. I believe in 2020. I have to double check that though. And one important thing that I'd just like to point out to the committee at the beginning here is that the form or methodology for ranked choice voting in this bill will, and that's for both the local elections and for the presidential primaries, will be instant runoff voting, or Hare method is another common phrase for this. And that is, I've kind of explained it a little bit more in lay terms in the bottom half of at the end of the overview on page 4 and 5. So beginning with the first part of the bill again, this is the opt-in ranked choice voting system for towns, cities, and villages. Section 1 will amend Title 17 VSA, Chapter 55, to add new subchapter 4 titled Ranked Choice Voting. This new subchapter will add 6 new statutory sections. And they are all section 2691 and then A, B, C, D, E, F. A will add definitions of relevant terms. And I'd just like to pause and say, if you have any particular questions, feel free to just jump in and interrupt me. I'm happy to switch over to the actual language in the bill and really kind of take a fine-tooth comb to that. New section 2691B will permit towns, cities, and villages to opt in using the ranked choice voting system by either a town vote or a vote by the legislative body. And a town, city, or village must have already voted to elect officers by the Australian ballot system. It's a prerequisite. And once opted in, a town, city, or village may discontinue the use of ranked choice voting at any time, similarly by either a town vote or a vote by the legislative body. However, there's a little nuance to that. The legislative body may not vote to discontinue the use of RCV if RCV was originally adopted by a town vote. What's there?
So the select board can't say, we don't like this ranked choice voting thing, even though the voters previously approved it. But the voters could vote a ballot question at an annual meeting or general election.
Right.
And
if the legislative body voted it in, they can vote it out.
And could there be a ping pong, like if the legislative body tries it and then discontinues it, then the voters can reinstate it and then decide they don't like it. Is there a limit to how many times they could change it?
There is no limit, but it would depend on the parties of who can discontinue it.
Like the voters could discontinue it if the legislative body enacted it.
Right.
But either could discontinue it if they enact it. Like,
Yes,
so you could theoretically have several on and off.
you could, yes.
Okay.
Representative Nugent.
Just wondering how that would impact, if at all, town meetings that are still done in person or not Australian ballot.
A prerequisite for ranked choice voting is Australian ballot system has to be adopted at that point. So if they haven't done that, then they would be eligible to adopt this.
That makes sense. Yeah, so ranked choice voting, if you're doing all of your business on the floor, it's not even a consideration. It's only for towns that have already adopted Australian ballot.
And you can't go from a voice vote to ranked choice voting. You have to, it's like buying a hotel in Monopoly. You have to buy the house first and then like, you know what I mean? Like, is that how it works?
That sounds right to me, Tim. Would you say that it's because, so if you're a town where you've been voting from the floor for your annual meeting elections, that you would have to first adopt Australian ballot, and then choose to use ranked choice voting for your local elections after adopting Australian ballot.
Yep, that's right.
You're welcome for that analogy.
Was very on brand. I appreciate it.
Next section that will be added, statutory section, still in section 1 here. This will be 2691C, and that describes how ballots must be formatted. 2691D will be added, and this describes the process of RCV tabulation. In essence, just diving a little bit into the methodology here for instant runoff voting or hair. In essence, if there are more than, well, first off, if there's a simple majority in the first round tabulation, the winner is the person who received the most votes, and the rest of what's considered to be the elements of ranked choice voting don't really come into play. However, if there is no majority vote in the first round, and there are more than 2 active candidates, the active candidate with the fewest votes is eliminated. The votes for the eliminated candidate are then transferred to the ballot's next ranked active candidate, and a new round of tabulation begins until there are 2 or fewer candidates, and the candidate with the most votes is declared the winner at that point. And again, this process is described at the bottom of the overview and then specifically in statute as well. 2691E will be added, and this describes the results reporting requirements, which will include vote data in each round of tabulation in addition to the final results. 2691F will be added, and this enables towns, cities, and villages to enact additional ordinances for the proper and efficient administration of the RCV system at the local level. Section 2 of the bill states that a town, city, or village may only use the ranked choice voting system beginning at the 2024 annual meeting. Nevertheless, a town, city, or village may vote to adopt RCV before then, but may not actually use that system until the 2024 annual meeting. You can kind of set things up, but not actually implement it until that one date. And I'll pause there because that's the end of the first part of the bill for the municipal opt-in.
One of the things I was trying to get at in my question on that section to Senator Vyhovsky was about the fact that it's very unlikely that a town would actually do this before the earliest you could really vote on it would probably be the 2023 November election. And so the 2024 annual meeting is probably the first time a town could really use their opt-in. And even that, I think, would be really, really, really fast. Like a town would have to already sort of have laid the groundwork for wanting to do that if they were putting the question to the voters.
And the town could have a special election too.
But I mean, the politics of doing that just for adopting ranked choice voting, I think would be, I don't know too many towns that that would do something like that. Okay. Cooper.
Is it, is it commonplace in the type of parliamentary procedure that is generally used in town meetings that changes that happen don't go into effect until after the meeting closes?
The instantaneous nature of effectiveness is upon passage by if they vote,
Well, it comes to-
depends on what's I mean, there could be an implementation date, but typically if it's something that's passed by the legislative body, it would be.
What kind of goes to the
Passage.
question that Representative Evans was asking about, my interpretation of the question, put it that way. Can you vote to adopt an Australian ballot and then vote to do ranked choice sort of in the same fell swoop?
Right, I'd have to double check the statutes pertaining to Australian ballot as to see when that could be implemented. I think it's something about the next election, if memory recalls. I'd have to double check that, get back to you though. Sorry.
Next time we have Carol Dawes, our clerks back in. Yes, Representative Boyd.
Section 1, I just want to clarify that would make sure that towns, cities, and villages enable like a specific location for counting, and is that what that's?
They can pass ordinances that would provide additional specificity, which could include the placement of tabulation centers. Sure. It could also include other things like any particulars in nuances of any kind of gaps that are found, but really it is for the administrative aspects of it. So, but yeah, time, place, manner could be fixed by ordinance. The next part of the bill pertains to voter and presiding officer education. Section 3 will require Secretary of State to provide training and information regarding RCV processes to presiding officers in those towns, cities, and villages that have adopted ranked choice voting. And then also here, I'd like to just note that Section 4 was removed by the Senate Appropriations Committee, as the Senator had mentioned, and this had appropriated funds to train and implement RCV in those towns, cities, and villages.
Sorry, Tim, could you repeat the last half of that sentence?
Sure. So there was Section 4 in here, and that was removed. I think it just say deleted. And this was an appropriation that was stripped out by the Senate Appropriations Committee.
So there's no provision for funding to train people?
Not anymore.
Currently?
I thought I heard Senator Bukowski say it was stripped out of this bill, but placed on the wall for inclusion in the bill. Did it make it there, or?
I'm not sure exactly if Senate Appropriations is considering funding this. I don't know. The next part of the bill pertains to the Ranked Choice Voting Study Committee. This is in Section 5, and this will establish that committee. Committee members will be 2 current members of the House, 2 current members of the Senate, 1 designee appointed by the Secretary of State, 3 designees appointed by the Vermont Municipal Clerks and Treasurers Association. I just want to note here that those appointees will be from different sized towns, cities, and villages, different regions, and at least 1 shall be from a town, city, or village that uses a hand count in elections. Also be 1 designee appointed by the Vermont League of Cities and Towns, and a member from 2 different organizations focused on the conduct of elections. The committee shall study ranked choice voting systems with the goal of having recommendations implemented for all primary and general elections for state and federal offices occurring in 2026. And this will include the following issues. 1, education of voters. 2, the training of town clerks, presiding officers, and election staff. 3, election integrity, security, and transportation of ballots. 4, technological requirements and tabulation hardware and software. 5, methodology of ranked choice voting systems. 6, canvassing of votes and roles of canvassing committees. 7, post-election processes and reporting. And 8, other items relating to the design and implementation of ranked choice voting systems. The committee shall report on the above by January 15th, 2024, and the committee shall sunset November 1st, 2024. Pause there.
Tim, can you give me an example of an organization focused on conduct of elections?
I think one of the examples that came up in the Senate was the League of Women Voters, maybe, something like that. But it is a broad term, so that would be up to folks who determine. Let's see, actually.
Could BPERG be considered a organization focused on conduct of elections?
I'm not too familiar with the extent of their mission. I do know that they have some election staff, so perhaps. Let me see exactly who.
That designee number 6 would be appointed by the Speaker of the House. And then
Yes,
a different organization would be appointed by the Senate Committee on Committees.
Yes, exactly. So it would be up to the determination of either the Speaker or the Committee on Committees as to whether the designee appropriately meets the criteria of being from an organization focused on the conduct of elections.
Representative Cooper.
No, just stretching.
Oh, that looked like a hand up. See, I did that. That's yesterday. I did that with you. I did that with Hooper today. All right. Yeah. I'm getting a little bit too.
Actually,
You ever have somebody dawns now, you're like,
don't want to let it. It would probably be appropriate to have people come to this group without a predetermined agenda on where they want to go. I don't know how we would guarantee that, but that would seem.
Everybody's getting in jail these days, Bob. And let's keep rolling.
The next part of the bill, the third final part really, pertains to ranked choice voting for presidential primary elections. And just want to quickly note that the relevant statutes in this part of the bill are going to be located in Title 17 for elections, Chapter 57, which is particular to presidential elections, and Subchapter 1, presidential primaries. A little bit different area where these statutes live. This has, let's see, Section 6 through 10. Section 6 redesignates some of the existing statutory sections, particularly 2705 and 2706, essentially kind of moving them back to make more room for the new ranked choice voting statutory sections. We thought just from a drafting perspective, that make more organizational sense. Section 7 will add and then modify certain statutory sections to enable the RCV system to be implemented in presidential primary elections. These amendments include creating a new section 2700 for definitions. And these definitions are very similar to those in Section 1 for the municipal opt-in. Section 7 will also modify ballot requirements in existing 2701, 2704, and explicitly require that a presidential primary election for a major political party be conducted using ranked choice voting. We'll also, let's see, dictate the type of ranked choice voting methodology to be used in a new section 2705. And again, that's the instant runoff voting or hair method. And this section will also permit the party to award delegates either on a winner take all or on a proportional basis. Tabulation of ballots is described in a new section 2706 with particular direction on how to award delegates depending on whether the party opted to award delegates either on a winner-take-all basis again or proportional basis. Reporting are in section 2707, and information from canvassing committees will be in section 2708. Back to the bill sections. Bill section 8 will direct the Office of the Secretary of State to adopt rules to address various aspects of administration and implementation of ranked choice voting in presidential primaries, that is. Section 9 will require the Secretary of State to ensure that canvassing forms, including tally sheets, summary sheets, and returns, are all designed to accommodate ranked choice voting. Section 10 sets the effective dates for the portions of this bill. There's a few different effective dates here. Sections 1 through 5, the municipal opt-in, will take place upon passage. These sections, not only municipal opt-in, but also this will contain the ranked choice voting study committee will also go into effect upon passage. That's section law. Sections 6 and 7 shall take effect on January 1st, 2027. These sections pertain to the substantive statutory law being created and amended to enable RCV for presidential primary voters. And section 8 regarding rulemaking for presidential primaries. And 9, the tally sheets, summary sheets, and returns for presidential primaries will take effect on January 1st, 2025, with the aim to provide the Secretary of State additional time to prepare in advance for the implementation of RCV for presidential primaries. And that concludes the high overview of the bill's structure. Again, on pages 4 and 5 of the overview, I'm going to put the mechanics of instant runoff voting into what I hope is a little bit more kind of digestible format for the committee. I'm happy to go through that now if you'd like, or we can jump into vote, however the chair would like.
Yeah, so I think our goal today, because I think when we get into our discussion of H4 24, the reason that I wanted to just remind us what's in S32 before we dive into that is that the methodology of ranked choice voting. So I guess my overarching question for you, Tim, is where is it in S32 where we're specifically saying it's going to be the Hare method and IRV? I just wanted the committee to kind of understand how that's baked into both the municipal and the presidential primary.
Yes. So it's largely really the same methodology, both for the local or municipal opt-in as well for the presidential primaries. Specifically in the bill, the methodology is described for the local opt-in, section 1, and what will be the new section 2691D, the process for describing the tabulation. And then for the presidential primary, that methodology will appear in, let's see, Bill Section 7, and in particular, a new Section 7, Title 17, BSA Section 2705, and then 06 as well.
So
that's just pinpointing it. I'm happy to.
Yeah, I think we will have an opportunity to talk about the sort of Hare method, but I think the committee's familiar enough now that unless anybody really wants to dive into specifics of how the IRV method would work as presented, I think we've heard this explained a couple of times by different witnesses in these, both Senator Vyhovsky today and some of our previous testimony. The idea that we're ranking all the candidates and the rounds of voting. I think the basic elements of that are familiar to everybody on the committee, unless I'm mistaken. Representative Nugent.
I wouldn't mind just seeing a demonstration with some ballots.
Okay.
That would be,
Yeah.
yeah,
good point.
that would be maybe good for our listeners to hear too.
See it on the screen.
We can sports bet on the outcome of the bill.
That isn't legal yet.
It's not legal yet, yeah. And actually, we did not enumerate. We did not enumerate political apparatus as a drug category.
But in all seriousness, that is absolutely on my agenda. And it's one of the reasons that I don't want to give anybody the impression that we're going to move this out super, super fast. So I'm trying to make sure that we're putting everything out on the table before we sort of dive into all the specific machinery. And one of the things that Representative Cooper and others have asked me to get on the table was that this isn't the only methodology. But I think what's important to hold for our next conversation is just that this specific methodology is about, and correct me if I'm wrong, Tim, when there are multiple candidates for an office and none of those candidates have reached a 50% threshold, that the lowest one is eliminated and the second choice of the ones eliminated will be applied to the totals of the first two until they cross that 50% threshold in multiple rounds. It only takes one round, and the second choices bump that plurality person up to above 50%. And that's the Hare method IRV as it's described in these sections that Tim just referenced.
Maybe we'll be lucky enough to have somebody come along who can dig into the depths.
Yeah, so that's the entire point of the time I'm giving for this conversation this morning, Representative Cooper, and next Tuesday. All right, so Representative Boyd.
It would be great to hear more information about the possible organizations that would be involved in the study committee. I think it's important that they are possibly not partisan.
Yeah, so I don't disagree with you at all. I'm trying to frame today's discussion about methodology, and we can totally get into that next.
Yeah, I'm just thinking
week.
like for future conversations.
Oh, 100%. Yep. I think that it's important for us to dig into all the aspects of this bill. I'm just trying to take it one crack at a time so that we don't get totally lost. All right. Well, Tim, I think that is enough on S32 for right now. We will dive into the details as we move forward. So I want to switch gears and invite Representative Hooper to tell us about H424, which is very much related to this, but has a different methodology.
There it is.
That's a little Hooper solidarity for you.
We have a walk-up song.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Robert Hooper from this committee. Right over there.
From right there.
In terms of 424, it basically is companion to some degree, although antagonist to the bill that we were just talking about. Everything that I say now will be caveated by the phrase, "This is my understanding of," because when we get into the part that the Chair was just elaborating on, the methodology, that's where the rubber really hits the road between the two systems of voting. So in 424, I tried to lay out some of the things that are important, I think, to the voting process and make sure that they would be included in the process we adopted, which effectively could eliminate one of the systems, computing who the winner is. There are reported, I think our friend from Harvard will probably elaborate on this much more, differences between the two that could favor one candidate over another, depending upon how the votes are done. The Condorcet method preserves something in the state that we should look very critically at, and that is the ability to have the precinct that you vote in publish the results of that vote so that you know when you walk away from the polls after they close who was the victor in your area. Hare method is used in other states, and it has been inferred that if there is really a contest where somebody isn't clearly the winner in you either have to go for a recount like I think they did in New York City, or things get drawn out like in Alaska, you can wait a long time to get the results. New York was over a month, I think. So you don't know who's actually winning once the ballots actually leave your polling place. That's different with the other method because that computation can be done locally. Again, my understanding. It's sort of been mentioned that during the last presidential election, when somebody was looking for an extra 11,000 votes, if the ballots had been transferred someplace, it would have been opaque until that computation was actually done. It would have been more possible, although not necessarily probable, that some votes might have popped up someplace because there were no totals available. Would be no totals available at the local election sites.
Representative Hooper, are you implying that
I imply nothing.
that the custody of the ballots is the thing that you're bringing into question, whether the need for a statewide count?
Yeah, possibly. Maine was reported to have been considering transferring all their ballots to Augusta to be counted in an election where they were using a ranked choice.
Representative Nugent?
That just made me, when you're talking about the delay in the results for local elections, there is no like lame duck period, so something to consider.
And now I'm really going to have to hear you, Kate.
Just thinking about like the delay in the counting of ballots and how that, if a locality wanted to implement this, how that would impact potentially the transfer of power, because there is no lame duck period for local elections. So.
I think the concern that Representative Hooper is bringing up that leads into the delay, if I'm not mistaken, Representative Hooper, is about what would happen if there was a question about the summability, the ability to understand in order to sort of tabulate all of the ballots. My understanding is that the tabulation machines that we have will be able to, and we'll hear this from Director Senning when we have him in to testify again, and hopefully folks from the Clerks and Treasurers Association, but the idea would be that each tabulation machine would be able to tell us about the ranking and the tabulation. I think there are some states where, depending on the methodology, and this is part of why what the study committee I think is supposed to get at, if we were going to implement this across the state in multiple elections, is about sort of what happens if you can't really tell, if you have to sort of count all the ballots from an entire statewide election from all the precincts. Whereas with a local election, there's typically only one or a small handful of precincts. And so the chance for there to be some significant delay is a lot lower than in a statewide race. So the concern is more about statewide races, right?
Yeah, or multi-district.
Right.
I suspect Chittenden Senate would be an example of a lot of different places where people were voting that wouldn't necessarily have clear understanding of who won until all the ballots were commingled to some degree. With the system we have now, you can go look at the tape from the machine, add it up yourself and be done, but I think that becomes more problematic.
Representative Hangan.
I guess I don't really understand this because my towns, some of them hand count. Like, what's the problem you're trying to solve here?
The problem, I support ranked choice voting. The problem that I'm trying to solve is that I'm not particularly enamored with the idea of somebody that gets 40% of the vote taking office when 60% of the voters said, I don't necessarily want you. So you get to the point where the majority of the people who have voted said, yeah, this person is acceptable to me, as opposed to the majority saying this person is not acceptable to me.
How does this, I don't understand how this particular method solves that. Because that's kind of my feeling about ranked choice voting in some respect.
I think Representative Hango, it solves it, and solved might not be the word. It clarifies it maybe by allowing people to say, well, okay, maybe if not that guy, then maybe this lady. Take your pick of.
What might be helpful for us, Representative Hooper, since you've given us kind of the context and we know what some of the questions are, that are we're gonna try to solve for ourselves as we explore this bill over the next couple of weeks. Your bill, H 424, proposes a different methodology than what's envisioned in S 32. That's really the crux of it, right?
Yeah, and that's why I brought up the issue of the summer study committee trying to be as open-minded and not predetermined. I honestly don't know, based on factual basis, which system is better. But I do know that the system that we have used in Burlington before was widely reported to have failed. And that's the particular method that we are seemingly in the Senate bill rolling towards. So getting as much information, and frankly, I was asked, when I asked why we were heading for this HARE method, somebody said, show me where the Condorcet method has worked. And it's sort of like, well, we can show you 4 examples of where the HARE method has failed. Sort of the other side of that coin. As I said to Will, and Mr. Senning agreed, I don't know which item is better, but I would certainly want us to adopt the best possible if we're going to do it. And I think this has enough interest both statewide and nationally that we will once again be a front runner in this. So serve consideration to the rest of the country, but also that it seems to be the right thing to do to preserve as much democracy as we can.
Representative?
I have a little bit of an issue with it, and it was spoken about earlier in regards to a concerted effort on candidates to try to figure out where they need to align to maybe get the second set of votes. And that to me is a real concern for me as a candidate. Again, I'd like to feel that I can, represent myself to the constituency the best I can and not have to make a concerted effort to see how I'm going to game the ranked choice voting so that I can possibly pick up second choice votes. And again, I think I don't know if you presented this information, but there's some quotes from the Supreme Court of North Dakota that I think spell it out pretty eloquently.
I mean, it's an individual preference as to how you run a campaign as it is now. If you don't think that it matters that you go out and wave the Confederate flag or whatever you think is going to get you more votes, that's fine. In a certain population that everybody's in a bell curve and you're going to offend as many people as you endear. That's kind of the choice.
So, Representative Hooper, would you like to describe to us how this methodology is different than the HARE method, or how would you like to sort of present this bill? And would you like Tim to kind of walk us through the?
Well, I think that other testimony we will take might get into that a little deeper and more reliably than I might do. But essentially, I think the differences are that precinct summability part, which is, I think, fairly critical. And there are not so subtle differences in the way that the candidates are initially compared, so that in HARE you contribute different people's pools to different people in Condorcet. You look at people who win the overall matchups first, and they then maintain sort of a level as the process goes through. And I really would probably leave that to Mr. Johnson, but
Do you think it would be more helpful for us to hear from Mr. Johnson about his testimony, and then we'll talk about the sort of
might very well be.
differences? Okay.
I mean, I think that's going to generate enough information for us to at least have a good conversation with our Nobel Prize winner from Harvard when he shows up.
I think we're going to be hearing from that professor on Tuesday afternoon.
Yes.
Great. Well,
So this basically is just to keep options open.
understood. So we've got the Senate's bill is very focused on the Hare method. Representative Hooper is bringing a Condorcet method. And if you don't have anything else for us now, Representative Hooper, I'd like to invite Mr. Bristow Johnson up. And we'll hear his testimony, and then we'll take a break, and then we'll come back and talk about this whole thing. So, Robert, would you like to take the hot seat?
Morning, everyone. For the record, my name is Robert Bristow Johnson. I have lived in Burlington and in Vermont for 23 years. I'm a 21st century Vermonter, not a 20th century Vermonter. So I missed out on the genesis of Fish, on the genesis of Ben and Jerry's, on the genesis of Bernie Sanders as a candidate. And I missed out on Vermont becoming the first state to ban billboards, and Vermont becoming the first state to have civil unions, showing the rest of the nation how to do that. And we're a brave little state, and I'm going to try to persuade you to be a brave little state in another focused area regarding ranked choice voting. I have a slide presentation, and I thought I was on Zoom, but what happened to my Zoom? I'm sorry. I'm going to have to link again.
I did tell our committee assistant that if you have things that didn't.
I have slides.
Yeah, so what we normally do, it sounded like the Google Docs weren't working for her to be able to open them and share.
Right.
So if you do want to present them, we normally wouldn't do that, but I've said if you want to get on the Zoom and share those, that's fine.
Okay, I clicked the link again. For some reason, I had lost it, so I would like to share screen and then.
Yeah, it looks like you're coming back on from what Andrea can see. And so then we'll get you share permissions here and be off to the races.
Yeah, I think I'm.
Make sure you're off.
Gotta find it. All right, did that do it? Okay. Now, I think I'm shared. Now I gotta go back to Google Slides. What's the problem here?
It's nice to know there's somebody else who has a desktop that's as disorganized as mine. Appreciate that. Solidarity.
This moved.
Solidarity.
Now I can do share
Organize your.
slide. There's, what does it say to
Go to view.
okay, view, there it is, slideshow. I was looking under slide. All right, here we go. Now, how does that?
It's going to be the same on this screen. So
Oh, yeah, thank you. Yeah, all right. Okay, so I want to talk to you about the performance of instant runoff voting, which is the Hare method of ranked choice voting, and how it performed in Burlington, but not recently like this last month, but Kirka 2009. That was the acid test. In the Senate chamber, in the Democratic caucus, they had a mock election using ranked choice voting, and it worked fine. But I have to say that I believe that Senator Vyhovsky threw a softball at this. And you want your election method to work under the acid test too. And so if we have time and if it's amenable, I prepared some ballots to demonstrate what happened in Burlington in 2009. And it might answer a lot of questions, but that's a little later. All right, so let's continue on. One thing I want to clear up right away that the news media and the people don't understand, because it's always this dichotomy. You're either for it or you're against it. But the whole point of ranked choice voting is in case there is a third way. There is a third party or a third candidate, and it isn't just your Republican or Democrat or the two-party thing. I am not against ranked choice voting. I am for ranked choice voting. I'm hardcore for it, but we're doing it wrong, and I want us to do it right. So I'm going to very briefly just mention something about S32, and then I'm going to quickly go back into the Burlington thing. There are three different categories of elections that we're looking at, and we should expect different methods to happen with those three categories. There are single winner elections in which the only ethic that we're trying to accomplish is majoritarian. In single winner elections, it's winner take all. And sometimes people can misconstrue the term winner take all with first past the post. They don't mean the same thing at all. So winner take all means that whoever wins gets everything. And so then the only ethic left to get is the majority rule. When it's a multi-winner election, let's say it was a 3-candidate or 3-member state Senate district. And if in that district, it was approximately 65% Democrats and 35% Republicans, you might expect that one of the 3 Senate candidates elected would have been a Republican. But if it was purely majoritarian and the election method was majoritarian, all 3 of them would be Democrat, and that might not be fair. So you would expect a different method to be used for multi-winner elections than for single winner elections, where proportionality is the ethic. And then there's the presidential primary. That is a totally different thing. It's about fair apportionment of seats. It's a fair, we're not voting for specific delegates. We're voting for a specific candidate, and then given the amount of votes, how many seats of delegates does that candidate get? And then we'll let the candidate worry about filling those seats later. But how many do they get allocated? In S32, for the presidential primary, they give the parties the choice to take winner take all, in which the IRV winner would get all of the delegates, or proportional, but they do not specify, and that's a hole in S32, they do not specify how that those delegate seats are proportionally meted out. Now, we have a mathematical formula for it. It is used for Congress to allocate seats to every state every 10 years when we have a census. It's called the Huntington Hill method. And that is the method that we shouldn't be letting the parties tell us how to allocate proportional seats. We should be telling them, if you're choosing proportionality, this is how you will allocate the seats proportionally. And it should be exactly the same method that we allocate seats to the states in the US Congress. And it's called the Huntington Hill method. So that's enough about S32. So I am going to concentrate now on single winner elections, and I'm going to talk about Burlington because that is the election that until 2021 and 2022, that was the anomalous election. So I just recently published a paper in a journal called Constitutional Political Economy. It is a peer-reviewed journal by Springer Verlag. And this is a copy of, and it is on your website, on today's documents. This is a printed copy of the published version. I'm a little dissatisfied. They forced me to take out one of my tables and several of my graphics, which is in my submitted copy. I have printed a few of the submitted copy, and I only have 4 of those, but I'm happy to loan them to anyone.
Paper whenever possible, and I believe all the documents you sent, except for this Google Slides, are posted on our.
Google Slides I have to send to you in the future because I didn't finish it until.
We're seeing them, but I believe the rest of the documents that you sent are all.
That's just fine, and you guys can get that. Okay, that's fine. So the title of my paper was "The Failure of Instant Runoff Voting to Accomplish the Very Purpose for Which It Was Adopted." And I used Burlington, Vermont as the object lesson. Now, this failure has happened again now. It has happened in Alaska in August of 2022. And the topology of the failure is the same. The names are different and the numbers are bigger in Alaska. And I can explain that sometime in the future, but I'm going to concentrate on Burlington. So Hare RCV has formerly been known as IRV, but in 2010, Burlington repealed it. And in 2011, 2012, there's several other towns that repealed it. Ann Arbor, Michigan, Pierce County, Washington, Aspen, Colorado, Cary, North Carolina. They repealed IRV. They didn't have the same failure we did in Burlington, but they didn't like it. IRV as a terminology lost cachet. It didn't sound so good. And in my opinion, disingenuously, Fair Vote repackaged it, gave it a new name, didn't change it at all. But it's like new improved IRV, but it is exactly the same method. And I believe that is a little bit disingenuous because it implies that the only way to do ranked choice voting is to use IRV. And that has not been the case, and it hasn't been the case for 200 years. This is a 200-year-old argument. Condorcet was a French mathematician in the 18th century. He was also martyred by the French revolutionaries that he was allied with, which is kind of an interesting story. But he was a French mathematician and philosopher. Thomas Hare was a British barrister in the early 19th century that came up with the concept that we call the single transferable vote as a legal instrument. Anyway, RCV, the claims are, and this is actually what we want. This is why I support ranked choice voting, to guarantee that the majority candidate or the candidate with majority support is elected. And they say it right here on these flyers that we got mailed in Burlington when we were voting on ranked choice voting. Eliminates the spoiler effect, says so right here. Empowers voters to vote for third parties, and it levels the playing field so that third party candidates have the same level playing field as a major party. Because the problem is with the regular first past the post, people are afraid sometimes to vote for a third party or an independent candidate because they're afraid that the major party candidate that they dislike the most might get elected. And the other major party candidate that they dislike the least, they'll vote for that candidate because they're best situated to beat the candidate that they don't want to see elected. And then that disadvantages the third party candidates because somebody might say, hey, I'd like to vote for you, but I don't dare vote for you because I'm afraid of somebody else getting elected. So it's also to disincentivize, this is related, tactical voting. It's to allow voters to vote their hopes, not their fears. Now, this is the fact. In Burlington in 2009, Hare RCV failed at every single one of these goals. And it's an objective failure. It cannot be disputed.
Mr. Cooper, you have a clarifying question?
Who sent those mailers out?
I believe VPIRG did. Better Ballot Burlington Committee, but I know that VPIRG.
Are those the same, just two different sides?
No, they're two different flyers, but they're for the same.
I imagine you
Mind passing those around?
Yeah, that's
Let us take a peek at them.
Oh, yeah, I'll pass them around, by all means. By all means. And, all right. So I'm going to dissect this a little bit, what happened in Burlington, so that you understand it, and the mock election will solidify that if we have time for that. All right, here we go.
Who's running?
So you will see in this here, this was table one in my paper that they made me take out for the published version, but this was taken from another paper and it happened before 2021 when these other failures happened. And if you take a look at that, it's just a bunch of elections, including some in Ireland and stuff that had IRV. And if you look at the right-hand column there, it says Condorcet winner, and you'll notice there is a gap there, an anomaly. One election that was here, RCV did not elect the Condorcet winner, and that was Burlington mayoral election 2009. What was the consequences of that? How did that happen? And then again, why was it wrong? Why was it an error? So I'm going to talk about two principles, and then I'm going to talk about two properties that we want. These two principles, must-haves, one person, one vote. Namely, each of our votes should have an equal effect in elections. And in the scholarly world, they call it the principle of anonymity. It doesn't matter who you are, your vote should count equally. Closely related to that is majority rule, because how do we know that our votes are counted equally? Well, if more voters mark their ballot that candidate A is preferred over candidate B than the number of voters that mark their ballots to the contrary, then at least we know we're not going to elect candidate B. We don't know yet about candidate A because there's candidate C. Maybe candidate C is better than candidate A. But at least we know if more voters mark their ballots preferring A over B than the number of voters preferring B over A, let's not elect candidate B.
Representative Hango.
Thank you. So I'm still trying to wrap my head around ranked choice voting. So that essentially eliminates candidate B from going on to the next round?
Well, no, I didn't say anything about sequential rounds yet. The Condorcet method is truly instant runoff voting. It has simultaneous runoffs of every possible pairing of candidates. And that's why it's better than Hare. But I want to get into that. I want to explain what the principles are that we're trying to defend in democracy. And I'm going to try to explain why it didn't happen in Burlington in 2009. So this is very easy. The beginning of my paper, I start with, and it's funny, I grew up in North Dakota. I start with a ruling from the North Dakota Supreme Court where a different method of ranked choice voting called Buckland voting, and they struck it down. And it's because the way that one of the judges put it is elections are about a majority, but they're about a majority of people, not a majority of marks. Marks on a ballot don't have equal rights. It's people who have equal rights. So if you have two candidates, and this candidate has all of these supporters, and this candidate has fewer supporters. Candidate B has fewer supporters. But we know at the end of the day, if our votes were counted equally or not, if candidate B got elected, somehow those fewer voters for candidate B, their votes had more juice. Their votes had more effect for candidate B to get elected than candidate A.
Why?
Well, because there's fewer of them. There's fewer of them. If there's fewer of us, I mean, there are other election anomalies that have happened, and I don't want to get into a fight about the Electoral College, but in fact, those in 2016, those voters who preferred Hillary Clinton over Donald Trump, their votes didn't count as much as those voters that preferred Donald Trump over Hillary Clinton, because there was fewer voters for Donald Trump than there were for Hillary Clinton. And yet Donald Trump was elected. Same thing in the year 2000. Those voters who preferred Al Gore had votes that had less juice, that counted less than those voters for George W. Bush, because there were more voters for Al Gore than for George W. Bush. Yet George W. Bush got elected. So if at the end of the day, if candidate B gets elected, those guys had votes that had more effect, that counted more than the larger number of voters that supported candidate A, and candidate A was not elected.
Representative Chase.
One thing that I just looked up that helped me, the Condorcet method, as I understand it, is if you three were running against each other, there would be three individual elections. There would be Rep. Hango versus Rep. Morgan, there would be Rep. Hango versus Rep. Hooper, and there would be Rep. Hooper versus Rep. Morgan. So each person would vote in each of those three pairings. So they would,
They just vote in one.
have three separate choices.
And that's the conversation.
And I think, I think right now, I don't want us to get too deep in this until we've heard Mr. Broussard Johnson's testimony, because I think he's gonna get there.
We're getting there.
All he was framing up was the very important point, which I think, so I just want to make sure our whole committee really gets this point,
Yes.
which is really, really essential, which is that today, without ranked choice voting at all involved in, we have systems in our country that have the popular vote winner lose an election. That's all you're trying to say.
Exactly.
But that's because they're voting for delegates who then vote.
Yep.
So what's wrong with that?
Totally different.
I think Representative Broussard Johnson's point, he didn't want us to get into the debate. He was
Okay.
just putting that out on the table for us to think about.
Just wanted to point that out there.
What's wrong with it is that our votes aren't counted equally because they don't have equal effect. So those are the must-haves. Those are principles. I consider those to be as important as a secret ballot. I consider them to be as important as process transparency in election. Here are nice-to-haves. We want to avoid the spoiler effect. What does it mean to be a spoiler? A spoiler is a loser whose presence in the race materially changes who the winner is. So if the voters say, hey, we like candidate A better than candidate B, and candidate A was going to get elected, but then candidate C enters the race and somehow that changes the election and gets candidate B elected instead. Candidate C did not get elected. Candidate C was a loser, but candidate C's presence in the race materially changed who the winner was. We're trying to avoid that because what it leads to is tactical voting. People are afraid to vote for the candidate that they really want because they vote for that candidate. He might spoil the election and cause the election somebody that they dislike even more. Very good examples we have. The last mayoral election in Burlington in 2021, but a better one, in my opinion, is the 2014 gubernatorial election that had Peter Shumlin, Scott Milne, and a libertarian candidate named Dan Feliciano. I don't have the numbers up, but I can tell you this. The margin of victory that Shumlin had over Scott Milne was 2,400 votes statewide, only 2,400 votes. Dan Feliciano got 8,400 votes. Now, I don't know how you guys feel about libertarians and where they are on the spectrum, but other than marijuana, I don't think I have much in common with libertarians. I mean, they want to burn whatever they want in their burn barrel or cut whatever trees they want in their back 40. And us liberals might not agree with that. Now, what if these Dan Feliciano voters, what if Dan Feliciano didn't run and those 8,400 voters split 2-1 in favor of Scott Milne? What would have happened? We would have been swearing in Governor Milne in January of 2015. All right. So then these voters for Dan Feliciano, they're going to have to think about, and also the candidate, was it a good idea that I ran? Or these voters are going to have to think about, was it a good idea that I voted for this guy and caused the election to turn out even worse from their point of view? So what happened in Burlington 2009? 4,064 voters marked their ballots that Andy Montrol, the Democrat, was preferred over Bob Kiss. 3,476 voters marked their ballot that they preferred Bob Kiss over Andy Montrol. Andy Montrol was preferred by a margin of 588 more votes. Yet Bob Kiss was elected. That's not avoiding the spoiler effect. In Burlington in 2009, the Republican, Kurt Wright, many of you know who he is. He didn't mean to be the spoiler. He ran to win. He had every right to run. He should have run. It was his right to. But simply by being a candidate in that race, that caused the election of Bob Kiss. Whenever this failure happens, it's always the loser in the final round who becomes the spoiler. Had Kurt Wright not run, then Bob Kiss and Andy Montrell would have met in the final round. That's when there's two people, and that's when we all agree who should win. When there's two people, it's the person with the most votes wins. And Andy Montrell would have defeated Bob Kiss by a margin of 588 votes, or about 6.5%. That's a decisive victory, but it wasn't a victory. Andy Montrell didn't win, and Bob Kiss did win. So then that failure cascades to another failure, which is it incentivizes tactical voting. So what we're trying to accomplish with ranked choice voting is to give voters the ability to vote their hopes, not their fears. I can, even if I think that candidate that I really like doesn't have much of a chance, I can still vote for that candidate and not worry about wasting my vote on that candidate. What happened in Burlington 2009? This is what it looked like in the semifinal round. Now, because of the counting method, only those three numbers that you see here, the totals, this is a breakdown of each of these. Only these three numbers is what you saw in the IRV vote counting. And you'll see that Andy Montrell had fewer first choice votes than either Bob Kiss did or Kurt Wright. In fact, Kurt Wright had the plurality of first choice votes. And then using Hare RCV rules, using IRV rules, Andy Montrell was eliminated. The Montrell votes were divided. Many more of the Montrell votes went to Bob Kiss because their second choice was for Bob Kiss, but some of them for Kurt Wright. And the result was that Bob Kiss pulled ahead of Kurt Wright, a come from behind victory, and that's how the election was settled. Supporters for Kurt Wright were unhappy because they weren't prepared for this come from behind victory. They thought Kurt should have won because he had the plurality of votes. Now, these voters right here for Kurt Wright that preferred, they went to the poll saying, Kurt's my man. That's who I really want to vote for. But they really didn't want to see Bob Kiss elected. And they kind of covered their butt with a second choice vote for Andy Montrell. If only 1 out of 4 of those voters had anticipated that their candidate was not going to win and voted tactically. So this would be like Nader voters anticipating that Nader wasn't going to win, so they're going to vote for Gore instead to prevent what actually happened. If they had voted tactically, then it would have been Andy Montrell going into the final round with Bob Kiss, where he would beat Bob Kiss. Now, by that tactical voting, that doesn't change the balance between Montrell and Kiss. It's still a 588 vote margin in favor of Montrell, but it would have put Montrell into the final round with Kiss, which is where he belonged, because Andy Montrell could defeat either Bob Kiss or Kurt Wright in the final round had he been in the final round with them.
So is it a good takeaway from this that even IRV in a situation like happened in Burlington in 2009 in the mayoral election,
right?
That even with IRV, that there's still a lot of room for tactical voting and that voters are still, a good portion of them are going to be thinking potentially?
The answer is yes, if it's a close three-way race. If it's not a close three-way race, then the answer is no. So like going back to 2014, the Shumlin, Milne, Feliciano race, there was no problem. If they had RCV in that, and let's just say that 2/3 of the Feliciano voters liked Scott Milne better, they could have marked Scott Milne as their second choice vote. And then when Feliciano was eliminated, then those votes would have gone to Scott Milne and Scott Milne would have won. But that was not a close three-way race. Feliciano was nowhere close to being a real winner in that. However, in a close three-way race, it is tactical voting is still a danger. It is not true that as advertised, that it just removes that allows you to vote your hopes, not your fears. It allows these minor candidate or third-party candidates or independent candidates or, some diversity candidate. It doesn't necessarily it doesn't necessarily take that incentive away from the voter. Now,
So Representative Hango has a question.
Sure.
Before she asks her question, I just want to know, how many more slides do you have?
Not very many more, not very many. I do want to talk a little bit about precinct summability, but then.
Probably try to get to that quickly.
Okay.
Don't have a lot of time left and I need to give.
I will, go ahead.
Thank you. So I don't know very many people who vote tactically.
Right.
And actually really dive into the stats of it to do it properly. So will this Condorcet voting method eliminate the need to be a tactical voter?
There is no completely perfect method. Now, here are where the numbers are. In 99.4% of this RCV elections that the United States has had, that's about 500 elections, 60% of them had only two candidates and nothing would have made a difference. 40% had approximately three candidates or more. There might have been a difference. And there's about 14 out of these 500 elections that there was a come from behind victory. But in 99.4%, IRV and Condorcet agree on who the winner is. 0.4%, this would be two elections out of 500, they disagree. And then 1.2%, there was one election, it was in Minneapolis in 2021, where even Condorcet, and it's not any fault of the method, it's the voters were goofy. It turned out to be a rock, paper, scissors turnout, where candidate rock was preferred over candidate scissors. Candidate scissors was preferred over candidate paper, and candidate paper was preferred over candidate rock. And so then in the Condorcet method, the question is, who wins? Well, Mr. Devlin put in the language in H424, what to do about that. If there is no Condorcet winner, then let's elect the plurality winner, the guy who got the most first choice votes. But that is a possibility, and it did happen once, and it's going to be very rare, but the possibility is there, and they knew that for 200 years.
And there's been 500
RCV elections.
RCV elections. How many Condorcet elections have there been?
In the United States, none. Now, there in Italy, there are two cities that have a method that's a Condorcet method called the Schulze method, I think is how you pronounce it. And that method is also used in a town in Spain and, from what I read, a borough in London. So it is starting to get used. It's used in many, many organizations. The IEEE, the Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers, geeks like the Condorcet method because they understand what it's supposed to be about and what it's supposed to do. All right, I want to get back.
Morgan has a question.
I want to get back to this failure.
So just real quickly, I want to get Representative Morgan's question.
Yeah, my head hurts. But I'm trying to figure it all out. But anyway, I'm getting there. But following to what Rep. Hango said, I'm just wondering, and I'm not calling voters stupid by any means, but tactical voting, I go back to what she said. I still see, in my opinion, that you could end up with unintended consequences because you thought you were doing something that was tactically would get you and your friends or people that are like you to vote a certain, we're going this way or we're going that way. And they don't. And you have an unintended consequence out of it just because of the complexity. But maybe you're going to show something that makes it not complex. Well, I don't know.
I mean,
am I making sense of that?
I think so a little bit. I get in arguments with other activists and scholars about this. In fact, people agree with me. I differentiate between the notions of tactical voting and strategic voting. And tactical voting is kind of what, like tactical warfare or something. It's kind of like what you're doing right. And the tactical voting is when the voter himself, he walks in the voting booth and says like, oh, what should I do? The most common tactical voting is called compromising. And so the voter goes in the voting booth and says, gee, I really would like to vote for Ralph Nader, but I don't dare, so I'm going to vote for Al Gore. That's tactical voting. Now, strategic voting, a strategy is where a campaign will tell people, hey, vote this way because it'll help us. In ranked choice voting, a possible strategic voting is called burying, that would only work in this failure, this cycle that happened, this rock, paper, scissors cycle. If in 99.8% of the elections can't work. But in this weird cycle, it is possible that strategic voting, where you would deliberately, earlier Senator Vyhovsky was talking about similar elections, similar candidates, we call them clones. And so you have, the problem is that you could have two candidates that from a political point of view are almost identical. Everybody likes except maybe there's a personalities. One has one followers, the other has another followers. It is possible that like you have two moderates. And let's say that one of the moderates, we're going to rename him, instead of candidate moderate, we're going to call him radical centrist. And he tells his voters, let's bury the other moderate. So mark that other moderate the lowest possible. Even though you'd like that moderate, mark them as low as possible because maybe that will help me get elected. You know what I'm saying? That's strategic voting. It can backfire. It's bad. It can possibly happen in that weird 0.2% circular election, but not in any other Congress Day election. It would not work. If I can get back to this.
No, so just to cap it, I'm just two words summed up for me, voter confusion. And
Well,
it's what I keep coming back to in my brain, like.
This is what we tell them. Who is your favorite candidate? Who is the person you most want to see elected? Mark them number one. Now, if your favorite candidate isn't going to get elected, is going to get defeated, who do you next want elected? Now, if the method works correctly, which it did not in 2009, but if the method works correctly, your number two vote, all of you, 100% of your voting power will go to your number two vote if your number one vote is not going to get elected, will get beaten.
Yeah, no, I understand.
But only if the method works properly. And we want to be able to give the voters the assurance that it'll work properly. It didn't in Burlington in 2009. I want to dissect it and show you how it didn't. So one of the other promises that they make, that if your favorite candidate can't win, then your second choice vote counts. And that is a quote from the good governor that we had, Howard Dean. It's in the 7 Days paper from back in 2021 sometime. But that wasn't the case for these right voters. Did you vote for the loser in the final round? That would be these voters. If you did, then there's no second choice vote for you because Kurt Wright went all the way to the final round and the algorithm only looks at the first choice votes. In my paper, that would be these were the first choice vote. It does not look at the second choice votes, which is underneath here, until your candidate is defeated. But when Kurt Wright was defeated, the election was over. Bob Kiss was elected. And so those persons who had second choices, those second choice votes were never counted. Now, the 495 voters that actually marked Bob Kiss as their second choice, which is, I was wondering if that was sincere or if they were trying to bury Andy Montrell. I don't know what they're doing. Those 495 voters, they were not harmed because their second choice candidate was elected. But those 1,510 voters that chose Andy Montrell, the Democrat, as their second choice, they were harmed. Had their second choice vote been counted, a different candidate for mayor would have been elected in Burlington, Vermont. in 2009. Vote your hopes, not your fears. Those 1,510 right voters would have been better off voting their fears. They would have been better off marking Andy Montrol as their first choice, even though it wasn't their sincere intent. They would have been better off marking Andy Montrol as their first choice, and they would have prevented the election of Bob Kiss had they done that.
And so, Robert, I just want to make sure that so you're saying the assumption, just based on the ideological similarities or dissimilarities of the candidates, is that those folks would have preferred a different outcome?
Yes, the 1,510 voters that marked Kurt Wright as number one, marked Andy Montrol as number two, and marked Bob Kiss as not at all, maybe left them unmarked, but below both of them. They most certainly would have preferred Andy Montrol to be elected over Bob Kiss because they marked their ballots saying so. Now, from the ideological point of view, we know that that's the case because the Kurt Wright voters got many, many more of them. There's a lot more blue under these Kurt Wright voters than there is green under these Kurt Wright voters. Kurt Wright voters much, much more preferred the Democrat over the progressive, as you would expect.
The point being that if it was a Condorcet election and not an IRV election,
then Andy Montrol would have been elected.
Montrol would have been elected. Representative Hango.
And I just have to point out that maybe people didn't care who their second and third choices were. They knew what their first choice was.
Right now. Okay.
Right?
I did not, I'm sorry, I had a divided attention.
Yeah, so what I'm saying is maybe that the people who voted that way, the second and third choices, they didn't care what was their second choice and what was their third choice. They only wanted a first choice. Maybe they weren't even people who were proponents of IRV to begin with, but they felt the need to mark three choices.
They could have, most of the right voters, or not most, the second largest group only marked Kurt Wright and did not mark anybody as their second choice. 1,289 voters only marked Kurt Wright.
Yes.
Because that was their intent. If they marked Andy Montrol as their second choice, I am going to assume that that was their sincere second choice. That if they couldn't get Kurt Wright, they were going to take Andy Montrol.
Yeah, and I'm just saying maybe that really wasn't their sincere second choice.
Why would they then mark them?
Just to mark them. I mean, like, I'm speaking from the average voter that I know. Some people just mark their ballots just to mark them.
Okay.
Because they feel obligated, you know, I have three choices, I need to use them, but I really could care less whether it's number two or number three.
I mean, 6 years ago, in Chittenden County, when we had now what was known as the six pack, you guys know what I'm talking about. Very few people I know, and certainly not me, very few people marked all six candidates. Very few. Almost everybody I know marked two or three or four candidates. And the number of, when I worked the election, the number of what we call undervotes was quite large in that Senate race. All right, can I move on to, this is the final takeaway on what happened in the Burlington thing. This liberal town, I gotta choose between a liberal or a more liberal. Because if I vote for the guy I really like, that was Kurt Wright, more liberal gets elected. Literally, by marking Kurt Wright as their first choice, they caused the election of the candidate they least wanted to see elected. So here RCV, says it guarantees a candidate with majority support is elected. Not true. Eliminates a spoiler effect. Not true. Vote your hopes, not your fears. No, it kind of punished 1,500 voters for voting their hopes. Not true. Empowers voters to vote for third parties. Who is the third party in Burlington, Vermont? It's the Republicans. We're a two-party town, turns out, unfortunately. So the Republicans are the third party. They don't dare run a candidate for mayor because they know if they do, they're going to only siphon votes from the Democrat and make it easier for the Prog to win. But if you go back to 2009 and say, hey, well, we got this ranked choice voting, now you get to vote for your favorite candidate again. they get to remember what happened to them in 2009. Doesn't work either. It didn't in 2009. So, but Condorcet would have satisfied all of those. Condorcet would have fixed all of them because it would have elected Andy Montrell, and all of those desirable properties would have happened. So I want to get to this and then I'll be done. So the other major issue having to do with this is precinct summability. Now think about what happens in our elections now with first past the post. Think about what happens at the end of the day, last voter casts their ballot, then those of us with machine election, we go up to the machine and we have a little ID thing, a little font, and we press a button and it totals up the totals for every single race. And we publish those totals on the ticker tape and we post it at the front door of the polling place, which is inspectable by anyone to see, and people come up with their cell phones and they take a picture of it. Some of them work for the news media, some of them work for campaigns. And those totals that are added to corresponding totals. So here's an example. And then also, when it is a statewide race or one that's wider than a single polling place or a single town, how is that election decided? These totals are put on a document that are certified by the city clerks and sent to the Secretary of State's office. And so this was from my ward. And so this was Peter Welch. This is how many votes he got from there. These numbers are added to the corresponding numbers for the same candidates coming from every other town, every other polling place. And then from those totals, the totals of the totals, the Secretary of State can see who wins and who loses and certify the winner or loser. You lose that with HARE RCV, with IRV. You don't get to have that. What's the problem with that? You guys might remember this quote. Now.
Can you do the impression?
Pardon me?
Go ahead.
Yeah. What if Secretary Raffensperger was his name? He was a good guy. God bless him. He didn't fight. But what if he was corrupt? What if these guys in the Georgia Secretary of State's office said, hey, we're going to find our guy, Donald Trump, we're going to find him 11,700 votes. How would they do that if these vote totals were already published for public inspection and the campaigns already knew the numbers, the news media already knew the numbers? Where were they going to dig up 11,000 votes without changing some number that was already published? They couldn't. It was impossible. Having this extra redundant data path of what the vote totals are keeps our elections honest. And we lose that with HARE RCV. Because with HARE RCV, we have to take all of the ballots. This is assuming nobody got 50% on the first choice, because they do publish those totals. In Maine, Susan Collins, when she was reelected, she had 51% of the vote, and they didn't have to do the instant runoff thing. But if she had 49.9% of the vote, they would have had to haul 800,000 ballots to Augusta, Maine, and it would have been opaque. Nobody would have known what those ballots were. And
so I appreciate the caution, but I just want to take one quick step back.
Right,
Mr. Johnson, and just say that we're going to hear from some folks that talk about custody of ballots, ballot security, auditing. So one of the things I do not want to do in this room while we are talking about voting methodology and tabulation is to speculate so much that we assume that because we adopt a ranked choice voting method that we've thrown election security out the window. We are not discussing that in this room, and I would not allow that to happen. I just want to take everything down out of that.
I'm not trying to imply that you're throwing it out the window. I'm trying to say that there is an additional data path that is redundant that helps keep the election honest. That's all I'm trying to say.
Which is not necessarily impossible with HARE, but it could be if we
Yeah, I don't have this document, but it is posted in the thing. It's called the precinct summit. It's a one-page talking points and has the number of permutations. When Terrence Carroll speaks before you guys, when for Senate government ops, I know he talked about permutations, how many different ways you could, with hair, if you total up every possible way a ballot can be marked, that could be made precinct summable. And for 3 candidates, that's 9 numbers. You saw those 9 numbers that I put up. Those numbers could be totaled locally and then sent upstream and totaled to see who wins. But with 4 candidates, that 9 becomes 40. And with 5 candidates, that 9 becomes 205. Can you imagine a ticker tape with 205 subtotals? That is nasty, in my opinion. It'd be very difficult to be able to have a meaningful redundant check if the ticker tape at the end of the election for a 5-candidate election was 205 numbers. Go ahead. Yeah, Mark, thank you. Sorry.
Can you tell us more about this Vyhovsky softball you mentioned at the beginning?
Well, they did in this, the Senate Democratic Caucus, and Irene Renner told me she missed it. They did, oh no, I'm in trouble. I'm in trouble. I may have to run through this real fast before my battery.
Yeah, so we'll save the question. We're running out of time anyway. We've gone way over
All right.
what I thought we would do here, but.
All right. So I just want to say that precinct summability, besides this redundant check, it also allows us to know what the outcome of the election is on the night of the election. In Alaska, in November, they didn't announce the results until the day before Thanksgiving, 15 days after the election. We shouldn't have to put up with that. It's also an easier, decentralized way to do recounts if you have to do recounts. You don't have to do it all centrally at the central location. And an easier, decentralized way to deal with the outcome that combined write-in wins. What happened in 2010 in Alaska? Anybody remember that? What was her name? Lisa Murkowski lost her primary, but she ran anyway as an independent, and she won. So as a write-in, she won. Now, what's going to happen in Hare RCV if combined write-in wins? You have a problem. But if it's a Condorcet election, it's much less of a problem. All right. So that's pretty much all I wanted to say. It's not necessary to give up this basic function of precinct summability with ranked choice voting, but it is necessary to give it up if you use the Hare method. You lose that ability to have precinct summability. Here's one more false claim, and then I'm done. This is one of these national experts that Senator Vyhovsky talked about. Well, now it's gone because my computer just died. Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center said, does RCV affect the amount of time it takes to know who the winner is? And they said, no, you can tabulate it right away. It's a falsehood. The issue isn't how fast computers are to tabulate. The issue is getting all the data together. And in Alaska, they had to get all the data together to Juneau, Alaska, or wherever the central tabulation location before they could even begin the first round of counting. And that can take days for a statewide election. And if you're a big state like Alaska, it might even take 2 weeks. And that is what happened. All right, so I am done.
So I think that is a good recommendation for why the bill that's before us with S32 does not contemplate adopting RCV for statewide elections without thoroughly answering many of those questions. So Representative Cooper, you had a question.
Yes, just could you explain the softball?
Okay, well, I mean, they often, a lot of times there's videos and stuff that will, like, people will try to, they'll use RCV as a way to do, what pizza are we going to get, or what ice cream are we going to get, and they make a collective decision, and they show how, the least popular item got eliminated right away, and then changed the choice. What has often happened is that they'll throw a softball that the result of the election will seem reasonable to people. And so what I thought, but we probably won't have time, but if you guys want to, I made 24 little ballots here. I turned a 9,000 ballot election into 24 ballot election. And so this is proportionately what happened in Burlington in 2009. And we could demonstrate what happened in Burlington 2009 and then demonstrate why it was a problem, why it was a failure. But it looks like we don't have
I
time.
don't think we have time to do that particular, and I think we spent a lot of time digging into what happened at Burlington, and I encourage people to read the documents that Mr. Johnson sent us, especially as it relates to precinct suitability and some of the concerns with the different methodologies. But this was a lot of information to take in, so I want to give the committee a break. We will be coming back to some testimony on this both tomorrow after 4 with a couple of national folks that have that we brought in to testify and give us information about the experience of other states. And then we'll be hearing from a professor that similarly, I think, to Representative Hooper and Mr. Johnson is an endorser of the Condorcet method. Representative Hooper, go ahead.
I hate to do this. A yes or no question.
Yes.
The primary difference between the two is the way the vote
Are counted, yeah. The ballot is identical. The meaning of the ballot is identical, but it's the failure of Hare RCV is not the ranked ballots. It was the way that they were counted is what caused the failure. And that failure doesn't happen that often, but it does happen, and it will happen again.
Well, we have been